Little boy ran to Vampire King crying, "They're hurting my mom." What Vampire King did is shocking. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's heart-pounding story. In a small, rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, there lived a boy named Ethan. He was only 10 years old, but life had already taught him harsh lessons. His mother, a waitress at the local diner, worked long hours to make ends meet. Despite the constant struggles, she always tried to keep a smile on her face for Ethan, but lately, it had become harder and harder. You see, Ethan's mother had been dealing with an abusive ex-husband, a man who would come and go like a shadow, bringing fear and pain wherever he went. Ethan's father had a violent temper, and his visits were always filled with threats and rage. The last time he showed up, he had left bruises on Ethan's mother's arms, and Ethan had watched in horror as his mother begged him to leave. But that night, things escalated. Ethan was terrified, his heart racing as he heard his mother's cries for help from the other room. His father was back, shouting at her, his words filled with venom. Ethan could hear the anger in his father's voice and the helplessness in his mother's pleas. He knew he had to do something, but he was just a kid. Fear gripped him, but there was no time to waste. He had to save her. In a panic, Ethan remembered the stories he had heard about the Vampire King. The legends told of a powerful, ancient vampire who ruled over the city, a figure cloaked in mystery and fear. People said that if you were in trouble, if you needed help, you could call upon the Vampire King, and he would come to your aid. Ethan didn't fully believe the stories, but in that moment, he felt desperate. Without thinking, he ran out into the night, the rain pouring down as he dashed toward the only place he thought might offer a sliver of hope, the Vampire King's mansion. His small feet splashed through the puddles as he ran, his breath quick and shallow, the only sound the thunder crashing above. He didn't care about the storm, he didn't care about the cold. All that mattered was his mother. As he reached the gates of the mansion, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The large, ornate doors loomed before him, and he hesitated for a moment. But then, gathering all his courage, he banged on the door, shouting through the wind and rain, "Please, help! They're hurting my mom." The door creaked open, and there, standing before him, was the Vampire King. His eyes glowed a deep crimson, his expression unreadable, but there was an air of power about him that was unmistakable. Ethan looked up, fear and hope swirling in his chest, and the words tumbled out, "Please, my mom. She's in trouble. She needs help." The Vampire King stood still for a moment, his gaze piercing through Ethan. He said nothing, but his presence was overwhelming. Without a word, he turned and motioned for Ethan to follow him inside. Ethan, still shaking from the adrenaline, did as he was told. What happened next was beyond anything Ethan could have imagined. As Ethan followed the Vampire King into the mansion, the door closed softly behind them, leaving the sound of the storm outside. The temperature inside was oddly warm, and the flickering light from the chandeliers cast long, eerie shadows across the grand hall. Ethan's feet felt heavy, each step echoing in the silence. The walls were lined with portraits of strange and beautiful faces, their eyes seeming to follow him as he walked past. He couldn't believe he was actually inside the mansion of the Vampire King, a place he had only heard about in hushed whispers and dark stories. The king led him through the vast, silent corridors, his steps graceful, almost predatory. Despite the fear gripping Ethan's chest, he felt an odd sense of safety with every step. The Vampire King was no ordinary man. His presence filled the space with a power that made Ethan feel both small and protected. Finally, they reached a room at the end of a long hallway, where the king paused and turned to face him. "You've brought me here for a reason." The king's voice was smooth, yet commanding. Ethan's heart raced, and he nodded. I don't know what else to do. My mom, she's in danger." The Vampire King studied him for a moment, his crimson eyes narrowing. "Tell me everything," he commanded. Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his courage. He explained the situation as best as he could, describing how his father had returned to their lives and started terrorizing his mother again. Every word felt like it was getting harder to speak, but the king's steady gaze gave him the strength to continue. When he finished, the Vampire King said nothing for a long time. The silence was almost unbearable. Finally, he spoke. I will help you, but there are things you must understand. Ethan nodded, his hope rising despite his fear. What do I need to do? Stay here, the Vampire King said, his voice low. I will deal with the situation. But know this, when I intervene, there will be consequences. Ethan looked up, puzzled. What kind of consequences? The Vampire King's eyes glowed with an intensity that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. The consequences of crossing me are severe, but you do not need to worry. I protect those who show courage. With that, the king turned, his dark robe trailing behind him as he strode towards the door. Ethan was left standing in the vast room, a million questions racing through his mind. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew one thing for certain. The Vampire King was not a man to be taken lightly. After what seemed like an eternity, the king returned, his expression unreadable. Come with me, he said. They left the room, walking through the mansion once again, this time with more urgency. The further they went, the more Ethan felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He couldn't help but wonder what the king had planned, and what would happen if his father encountered the Vampire King. As they reached a large, darkened hall, the Vampire King stopped and turned to Ethan. You're safe for now, he said. But your mother's troubles are far from over. I will handle them, but you must understand that once I intervene, everything will change. There is no turning back. Ethan nodded, the gravity of the king's words sinking in. He knew this was a turning point in his life. The king motioned for him to stay in the hall, as he approached a large door at the far end. He opened it, revealing a grand room filled with dark shadows and strange symbols. The air inside was thick with ancient magic, and Ethan could feel the power in the room pulse like a heartbeat. The king stepped inside, his voice echoing as he spoke. It's time to take action. Ethan stood frozen in the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what the Vampire King was going to do, but he knew one thing. The moment they stepped into this room, everything would change. He could only hope that the king's promise of protection would be enough to save his mother from the horrors she had been enduring for so long. Ethan stood in the grand hall, his heart racing, waiting for the Vampire King to return. The weight of the king's words hung heavily in the air. Everything will change star. He wasn't sure what exactly that meant, but the way the king had said it left no room for doubt. The Vampire King was preparing to act, and whatever he planned, it would have consequences. Ethan didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. His mind kept racing back to the one thing that had brought him here, his mother. He had to protect her. He had to make sure she was safe from his father. The king had promised that he would help, but Ethan still couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. As the king disappeared behind the darkened door, Ethan heard a soft whisper of movement from behind him. The sound was subtle, but it was enough to make him tense. Turning slowly, Ethan saw a figure emerge from the shadows, a woman, her face pale and cold, wearing long black robes that seemed to blend with the night around her. She was tall and elegant, her presence as commanding as the king's, though there was something colder, more distant in her demeanor. Ethan instinctively took a step back, his hand instinctively gripping the fabric of his jacket. The woman didn't move at first, but her eyes locked on him with an intensity that sent a chill through his bones. Then, as if sensing his discomfort, she spoke, her voice soft yet sharp. You're the boy who brought him here, aren't you? Ethan swallowed hard and nodded, unsure of how to respond. Yes. I came for my mother, he stammered. The woman studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. Finally, she nodded once, as though she had come to some conclusion. The king will do what he must, she said cryptically, her voice carrying a weight of finality. But you should know that this is no small thing. What he does for reasons far greater than you understand. Ethan didn't know how to react. What do you mean, he asked. There are forces at play, young one, she said, stepping closer, her eyes never leaving his. Not just your mother's plight, but a much older game, a game that the king has been forced to play for centuries. Your role in this is more than you know. And for your mother's safety, for your own, you must trust him. Ethan's chest tightened. The words were cryptic, and he could barely understand them, but there was an undeniable truth to her tone. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than him, bigger than his mother's suffering, and that terrified him. Before he could respond, the woman turned abruptly and walked toward the door the vampire king had entered, her robes trailing behind her. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, the silence hanging in the air like a thick fog. But then, with a deep breath, he steeled himself. He couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. His mother was depending on him. The time had come for the vampire king to act, and Ethan could only hope that whatever the king had planned, it would be enough. As he made his way toward the door, he couldn't help but wonder about the woman's words. What game was she talking about? What forces were at play? And most importantly, what kind of man was the vampire king, really? The door opened, and the vampire king stood there, his eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. His expression was unreadable, but there was a sense of purpose in the way he stood, like a predator poised to strike. "Come," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "It is time." Ethan followed without hesitation, his nerves on edge, unsure of what was to come. As they made their way down the winding corridors, Ethan could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind them. It was as if the entire mansion had come alive with the king's presence, the air thick with power and anticipation. The king led him into a large, ornate chamber. The walls were lined with ancient books and scrolls, the air thick with the scent of dust and age. At the center of the room was a massive stone table, covered in strange symbols and runes that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "This is where it begins," the vampire king said, his voice low. Ethan looked around, confused. "What do you mean?" "You came here to protect your mother," the king said. "But you must understand that you are not just a boy caught in a fight. You are part of something much larger. A game, as the woman said, and I will show you what that game is. But you must be ready. Once we start, there will be no turning back." Ethan felt his heart race again. What was happening? What game was he being drawn into? He had no answers, but the king's words were clear. The time for fear was over. The vampire king was about to make his move, and Ethan would have to stand beside him, whether he was ready or not. Ethan stood still, his eyes fixed on the vampire king. The room was silent, filled only with the sound of his breathing and the faint crackle of the flickering torches along the walls. His heart raced as the weight of the king's words settled over him. Once we start, there will be no turning back. What did that mean? Was he truly ready for whatever this was? His mind raced, thoughts swirling with fear, doubt, and a strange sense of anticipation. The vampire king was about to act, and whatever happened next would change everything. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening as the king turned towards the stone table in the center of the chamber. His fingers brushed against the ancient symbols etched into the surface, and the air grew heavy with power. Ethan could feel it, something ancient and deep, something that made his skin prickle with unease. "The time has come," the king said, his voice low and commanding. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. The king motioned for Ethan to approach the table. As he stepped forward, the strange runes on the stone began to glow faintly, casting an eerie light across the room. "You have a part to play in all of this," the vampire king continued. "You may not understand it now, but your actions tonight will decide much." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of the king's words pressing down on him. What part could a 10-year-old boy possibly play in something this monumental? The king seemed to sense his confusion. "You are not just a child," he said. "Your bloodline, your courage, they have led you here. You are connected to this in ways you do not yet comprehend." Ethan's mind raced. Bloodline? What did that mean? He was just a boy, a scared, helpless boy who had run to the vampire king for help. But there was no turning back now. The king's eyes glowed with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "This is where your journey truly begins," the king said. "The choices you make tonight will shape your future and the future of those you love." Ethan nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes to save my mom." The king's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "It is not only your mother who is in danger. There are darker forces at play here, forces that have been manipulating events for centuries. Your role in this is far more than just saving her. You are a key player in a much larger game." Ethan didn't understand. He had come here to save his mom, not to be a part of some twisted game. But the king was right about one thing. There was no going back. The vampire king raised his hand, and the symbols on the stone table began to glow brighter, casting an almost blinding light around the room. The air thickened with energy, and Ethan could feel it, crawling over his skin, pulling him in. You will face many trials ahead, the king said. But you must stay focused. The enemy is closer than you think. Your father, he is not the only threat. Ethan's stomach churned at the mention of his father. He had always feared the man, but now, knowing that the king had said there were other, greater threats, he realized just how small and powerless he truly was. What do I have to do? Ethan asked, his voice trembling. The first step, the vampire king replied, is to awaken the power within you. Before Ethan could respond, the king placed his hand on the table, and a burst of energy surged through the room. Ethan felt a strange pull, a connection, as though something inside of him was awakening. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. What is this? He gasped. The king stepped back, his eyes never leaving Ethan. Your bloodline, boy. You are not just a child of this world. You are connected to a power that even I cannot fully explain. But it is there. You must learn to wield it if you are to survive what is coming. Ethan shook his head, trying to process what the king was saying. I don't understand. I'm just a kid. I don't have any power. The vampire king's gaze softened for just a moment. We all start somewhere. But your path is different. It has always been different. Ethan felt the weight of his words sink in, but he couldn't fully grasp what the king meant. Now, the vampire king continued, we will begin. With a wave of his hand, the room shifted. The symbols on the table flared to life, and the shadows seemed to swirl around them. You must face the darkness that resides within you, the king said. Only then will you be able to protect those you love. Ethan stood there, overwhelmed by the power in the room, feeling both terrified and oddly hopeful. This was just the beginning, and already, everything was changing. Whatever came next, Ethan knew he had no choice but to follow the vampire king's lead. For his mother, for himself, and for whatever this strange, ancient game was that had drawn him into its web. The vampire king's gaze intensified as Ethan stood before the stone table, feeling the weight of the ancient magic that now pulsed through the room. The king's eyes, glowing with crimson power, fixed on him with an intensity that made Ethan's heart race. The room was thick with an unseen energy, the air heavy as though something extraordinary was about to unfold. You are ready, the vampire king said, his voice low and firm. But you must understand that awakening this power will come at a cost. Not just for you, but for those around you. Are you prepared for that? Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. He had no choice but to nod, though the fear in his chest was overwhelming. He had already seen the king's power. He had felt it. But this was different. This was about him. The king extended his hand, and Ethan stepped forward, his feet moving without thinking. The king's hand hovered over Ethan's chest, just inches from his skin, and the air between them seemed to crackle with tension. This is the first step, the king said, his voice like a whisper in Ethan's ear. Focus. Let the power flow through you. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. He had no idea how this was supposed to work, but he trusted the king. He had no choice. He felt a warmth deep inside his chest, a heat that spread outward, tingling through his limbs. It felt strange, unfamiliar, but not entirely unpleasant. The king's hand gently brushed against his chest, and suddenly, Ethan felt as if the room was spinning. His breath caught as the magic inside him surged. He could feel it now, a raw, untamed power, pulsing through his veins like fire. His heart raced as the energy intensified. Good, the vampire king murmured. Now embrace it. You are stronger than you know. Ethan could feel the power inside him building, threatening to overwhelm him. Panic began to rise in his chest. What if he couldn't control it? What if he lost himself to the magic? The king's voice cut through his thoughts. You are not alone in this. I will guide you. With those words, the vampire king's hand glowed with dark energy, and the magic inside Ethan suddenly shifted. It was no longer a chaotic force. It was focused, controlled, like a weapon being forged inside of him. The power pulsed with purpose, and Ethan felt a strange sense of clarity. He could feel the power of the earth beneath his feet, the pulse of life in the walls around him. He felt connected to everything. The world seemed to expand, and Ethan realized that he was not just a boy anymore. He was something more, something ancient. The vampire king stepped back, his eyes watching Ethan closely. "You have unlocked the first of your gifts," the king said. "This is just the beginning. The road ahead will be difficult, but you are now part of a much larger world. A world that you must learn to navigate." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood everything the king had said. He only knew one thing for certain. He was no longer just a frightened child running from his father. He was part of something far greater, and the stakes were higher than ever. The king turned toward the door. "Come," he said. "There is much more you need to learn. But first, we must deal with the threat that you brought to me. Your father is not the only enemy we face." Ethan followed him, his thoughts still reeling from the surge of power he had just experienced. He had unlocked something within himself, something that had been dormant for as long as he could remember. But what did it mean? And why had he been chosen for this? The king's words echoed in his mind. "You are not alone in this." Was that true? Was the king really there to guide him? Or was there something more sinister at play? As they walked down the corridors of the mansion, Ethan couldn't help but feel like he was walking deeper into a world he didn't fully understand. The further they went, the more Ethan felt like an outsider in a place that was becoming his home. The king stopped in front of a large wooden door and turned to Ethan. "Behind this door," he said, "is a decision that you must make. There is no going back from this moment. Are you ready?" Ethan didn't know what awaited him behind that door, but one thing was clear. Whatever happened next, his life would never be the same. With a deep breath, Ethan nodded. "I'm ready." The king opened the door, and Ethan stepped into the room beyond. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of 1,000 years of history pressing down on him. Inside, he saw a figure standing in the shadows, his father. His heart skipped a beat. How had he gotten here? What was going on? The vampire king's voice cut through the silence. "It's time to end this." Ethan didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. His journey had only just begun. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he stood facing his father, the man who had brought so much fear and pain into his life. How had he gotten here? What was happening? The vampire king stood behind him, his presence like a silent force, watching the scene unfold. Ethan's mind raced. His father's eyes were cold, filled with anger and something else, something darker. His gaze locked onto Ethan, and for a moment, everything else in the room faded into the background. "What are you doing here?" Ethan's father's voice was a low growl, filled with menace. Ethan didn't answer right away. He could barely speak, the flood of emotions overwhelming him. His father had been a shadow in his life, a figure who lurked at the edges, causing chaos whenever he appeared. But now, Ethan stood here, more powerful than ever, with the vampire king at his side. He had learned to tap into something inside himself, something he hadn't known existed. The king's words echoed in his mind. "You are stronger than you know." The vampire king's voice broke through the silence. "This ends tonight." Ethan's father scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think you can control me? You think you can just take my son from me?" The vampire king's eyes glowed with an intensity that made Ethan's skin crawl. "You never had control. Not over him. Not over anything." His father's sneer faltered for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Ethan could see it. His father was unraveling. The king stepped forward, his presence filling the room like a storm on the horizon. "You've made your choices. And now, you'll face the consequences." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but something inside him had shifted. He had the power now, the strength to stand up to his father. No more fear. No more running. This was his moment. His father took a step toward him, his eyes burning with rage. "You think you can just walk away from me, boy? You belong to me. You're nothing without me." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the power surging inside him, the magic he had unlocked with the vampire king's guidance. But there was something else, too. Something deeper, something primal. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He wasn't just his father's son. He was his own person, and no one could take that from him. Without thinking, Ethan raised his hand. The power he had been learning to control surged outward, and the room seemed to shift, the air thickening as the energy crackled around him. His father recoiled, his eyes wide with shock. "What is this?" he hissed. "What are you doing?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The power inside him spoke louder than any words ever could. "You've taken everything from me," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "But not anymore. This ends now." The Vampire King watched in silence, his expression unreadable. He had known this moment would come. Ethan was no longer the frightened child he had been when he first arrived at the mansion. He had grown, had learned, had become something more. His father's anger boiled over, and he lunged toward Ethan, but the Vampire King's hand shot out, halting him in his tracks. "No," the king said simply. "You are not his enemy. You are not his equal." His father's eyes flicked between Ethan and the Vampire King, his mind racing. But it was too late. Ethan's power was not something to be taken lightly. The room seemed to pulse with the force of his emotions, the very walls vibrating with the magic he had unleashed. "You will never control me again," Ethan said, his voice firm and unwavering. The king stepped forward, his presence now like a shield around Ethan, a barrier between him and his father. "Leave. Now. And never come back." His father's expression twisted in fury, but there was nothing he could do. He had no power here. He had lost everything the moment he had tried to claim control over his son. With a final, venomous glare, Ethan's father turned and stalked out of the room, leaving Ethan standing there, his heart racing, his body trembling from the power he had just wielded. The Vampire King turned to him, his eyes glowing with approval. "You did well," he said. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swelling within him. He had faced his father, and he had won. He was no longer a child. He was his own person. "It's not over yet," the Vampire King said, his voice quiet but filled with gravity. "There are greater forces at work here. And now that you've embraced your power, there's no turning back." Ethan nodded. He knew the king was right. This was only the beginning. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was ready. He had to be. He had seen what was at stake, and he would do whatever it took to protect those he loved. The room was still, the air thick with the tension that had followed Ethan's victory over his father. The Vampire King stood a few steps behind him, his presence both a comfort and a reminder of the power he had just unlocked. Ethan's body was still shaking from the adrenaline of the moment. He had faced his father, confronted the man who had tormented him for so long, and had won. It was a feeling he had never experienced before. Power, control, and a sense of freedom he had always longed for. But as the silence settled, Ethan realized that the fight was far from over. His father might be gone, but the world they were in was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The Vampire King's voice broke the stillness. "You did well, Ethan. But this is only the beginning." Ethan turned to face him, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? I defeated him. Isn't that enough?" The Vampire King's gaze softened slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. "Your father was only a small part of the greater danger. There are forces much darker than him, forces that have been watching you, waiting for you to make a move." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What had he gotten himself into? The king's eyes locked onto his, the intensity of their gaze sending a shiver through him. "You've awakened something inside yourself, something ancient. That power, Ethan, is what makes you a target. There are many who will come for you, now that they know you have it." Ethan's mind was racing. He had barely just begun to understand what had happened to him, and now he was being told that there were others who would stop at nothing to take it from him. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "What do I do now? How do I protect myself?" The Vampire King took a step forward, his voice steady and calm. "You learn to control it. You train. You prepare for what's coming." Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of determination rise within him. He had already faced so much fear, so much doubt. He had unlocked a power he didn't fully understand, but he would learn. He had no choice. "I'm ready," he said, the words coming out more confidently than he felt. The Vampire King's lips curved into a faint, approving smile. "I knew you would be." The king turned, gesturing for Ethan to follow him. As they walked through the dimly lit corridors of the mansion, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking deeper into a world he couldn't escape. The mansion itself felt like a labyrinth, dark, mysterious, and full of secrets. "There are others like you," the Vampire King said, his voice breaking through Ethan's thoughts. Children, humans, all of them with powers they don't fully understand. Some of them seek power. Some of them seek to protect others. But all of them are in danger. And it's your job to decide where you stand. Ethan's head was spinning. Powers? Other children? He had barely just begun to understand what was happening to him. But the Vampire King was right. This was far from over. There was a much bigger picture, and he had a role to play in it. As they reached a large chamber, the king paused and turned to face him. "This is where your training begins," he said. "You will learn to control your power here, and you will learn what it means to truly become a part of this world." Ethan's heart raced as he looked around the chamber. It was vast, filled with books, ancient scrolls, and strange artifacts. The walls were lined with symbols that Ethan didn't recognize, each one glowing faintly in the low light. It was a place of power, and it was here that he would learn how to wield the magic that had awakened within him. "You are not just a child anymore, Ethan," the Vampire King said, his voice low and firm. "You are a warrior in a war that has been fought for centuries. And now, you must prepare for what's coming." Ethan felt the weight of his words sink in. This was bigger than him. This was a fight that spanned generations, one that he had just been thrust into. But he wasn't the same scared boy who had come to the king for help. He was stronger now, more confident. And he would fight. Fight for his mother, for himself, and for the power that he had yet to fully understand. "I will train you," the Vampire King said. "But you must promise me this. No matter what happens, no matter how dark it gets, you will never forget who you are." Ethan met the king's gaze, the fire in his chest growing stronger. "I won't forget." With those words, the king nodded. "Then let the training begin." The air around them seemed to shift as the Vampire King raised his hand. The room filled with a faint, eerie hum, and the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter. Ethan's heart raced as he felt the magic in the air. This was it. This was the beginning of his transformation, the beginning of his journey into a world of power, danger, and destiny. And he was ready. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, with the strength of the Vampire King guiding him. The training was grueling. Every day, Ethan pushed himself further, his body aching, his mind exhausted from the constant barrage of lessons and physical tests. The Vampire King was relentless, never allowing Ethan to rest for long. He had shown him how to harness the magic within him, how to control the power that surged beneath his skin. But with each new lesson, there were more questions, more doubts. Ethan could feel the magic growing stronger, but with it came an overwhelming sense of fear. He had no idea what would happen when it fully awakened. What would he become? The king had promised to guide him, but Ethan was beginning to feel the weight of the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. He was no longer just a child trying to survive. He was part of something much larger. But with each passing day, he felt himself becoming more and more like the very people he had once feared, the monsters who lived in the shadows. The Vampire King stood before him now, watching as Ethan struggled to maintain his focus. "You are not focusing," the king said, his voice cold and commanding. "If you cannot control this power, you will never be able to protect anyone, including your mother." Ethan's breath caught in his throat at the mention of his mother. He had been so focused on his own training, so focused on learning to control his new abilities, that he had barely thought about her. Was she safe? Was she still in danger? "I can do it," Ethan said, his voice trembling, but filled with determination. "I will protect her." The Vampire King raised an eyebrow. "You think this power will protect her?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "You think that simply because you have power, you can save everyone?" Ethan clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the magic begin to surge within him. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how to control the power fully, but he would find a way. "I will do whatever it takes," Ethan said, his voice steadier now. "I have to protect her." The king stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ethan. "You are too reckless," he said. "That will get you killed." "I don't care," Ethan retorted, meeting the king's gaze. "I'm not afraid anymore." The Vampire King's eyes softened just slightly, though his expression remained stern. "You should be afraid," he said quietly. "Because if you are not, if you do not understand the consequences of what you're about to do, you will bring destruction down upon yourself and everyone you care about." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure if the king was trying to help him or scare him. But he knew one thing. He couldn't turn back now. He had made a promise to his mother, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. "Show me the next step," Ethan said. "I'm ready." The Vampire King nodded, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said. "We will begin the final phase of your training. You will face a trial, Ethan. It will push you to your limits and beyond." Ethan's stomach churned at the thought of another trial. He had already been through so much, physically, mentally, emotionally, but he knew there was no way around it. This was the path he had chosen. The king led him down the long, dark hallway of the mansion, the air growing colder the further they went. Ethan could feel the magic in the air, thick and oppressive. He had been training for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. The king stopped in front of a large wooden door, turning to face Ethan. "Once you enter," the king said, his voice low, "there will be no turning back. You will face your fears, your doubts, and your darkness. You must confront them head-on." Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He was afraid, more than he had ever been, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had already come so far. "I'm ready," he said again, though his voice was quieter this time. The Vampire King's gaze softened, just a fraction, as if he saw something in Ethan that he hadn't seen before. "Go," the king said. "Prove to me that you are ready to be more than just a child. Prove to me that you can handle the power within you." Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward, pushing the door open. Inside, the room was empty, save for a large stone altar at the center. The air was thick with energy, and the shadows seemed to dance around him. As soon as he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him, and Ethan was plunged into darkness. His heart pounded in his chest, and the magic within him stirred, as if sensing the danger ahead. "What is this?" Ethan whispered, his voice echoing in the empty room. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the chamber, and the shadows seemed to come alive. They twisted and writhed, forming shapes, faces, and figures, each one a reflection of Ethan's deepest fears. He gasped, stumbling back as one of the figures stepped forward. It was his father, the man who had caused so much pain in his life. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure reached out toward him, its eyes glowing with malevolent energy. But Ethan stood his ground. He wouldn't let his past define him anymore. "I am not afraid of you," Ethan said, his voice shaking but filled with resolve. The figure of his father snarled, disappearing into the darkness, but it wasn't the last of his trials. More figures appeared, representations of his fears, his insecurities, his doubts. Each one was more terrifying than the last. But Ethan refused to back down. He had a purpose now. He had a reason to fight. And no matter what came at him, he would face it. This trial was meant to break him, but Ethan was stronger than that. He had already proven that. And with the Vampire King's guidance, he would prove it again. The trial had taken everything out of him. Ethan stood in the center of the darkened chamber, his breathing heavy, his body trembling from the strain. The shadows that had once seemed so terrifying were now gone, faded into the air like smoke dissipating after a storm. The figures of his father, his past, the doubts that had clawed at his heart, they were all gone. And yet, in their place, there was something new. A feeling of strength, of power. Ethan's body still shook, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the sheer force of the power that was now inside of him. It was real. He could feel it surging through him, the magic alive, vibrant, and ready to be used. But with that power came the knowledge that he wasn't just facing his fears anymore. He was facing something much larger than himself. The door to the chamber opened with a heavy groan, and the Vampire King entered, his eyes glowing with the same intensity as before. There was no smile, no word of congratulations, just the silent, knowing look of a teacher watching his student. "You've passed the first test," the Vampire King said, his voice calm, yet filled with something deeper, something that hinted at approval. "But now, you must face the truth." Ethan straightened, his chest rising and falling with each deep breath. "The truth?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. The Vampire King nodded slowly. "You have unlocked the power within you, but the path ahead is fraught with dangers that you cannot imagine. You must understand the gravity of the choices you will make, Ethan." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had known that this journey wasn't going to be easy, but hearing the king's words made it all feel much more real. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was something else, a weapon, a force that could shape the future. What do I need to do? Ethan asked, his voice firm, though his hands still shook slightly from the trial. The Vampire King stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Ethan's. You must learn to control the power inside you, but more importantly, you must learn what it means to wield that power responsibly. There are enemies who will stop at nothing to use your power for their own purposes. The room grew colder as the Vampire King's words hung in the air. Who are these enemies? Ethan asked, his throat dry. You've already met one, the king said. Your father was a pawn in a much larger game. A game that has been played by the vampire houses for centuries. And now, with you awakening your magic, they will come for you. Ethan's stomach churned. His father had been a threat, but now he was just the tip of the iceberg. The king's words were a warning, but they were also a challenge. Ethan couldn't turn back now. He couldn't hide from what was coming. He had to face it head on. What do I need to do to stop them? Ethan asked, his voice sharp with determination. The Vampire King's eyes softened slightly, though his expression remained serious. You must train. You must master your abilities before they do. The houses will come for you, but they won't just come for you. They'll come for everything you care about. Ethan's heart clenched. The stakes had never been higher. His mother, the only family he had left, was in danger. But so was he, and he couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. I'm ready, he said, his voice unwavering. Teach me what I need to know. The Vampire King nodded, turning on his heel and motioning for Ethan to follow. Then let's begin. The next phase of your training will not be easy. You will face challenges that will push you to your limits. But if you want to survive what's coming, you must face them. Ethan followed the Vampire King down another dark hallway, his mind racing. He had no idea what the king had in mind, but he knew one thing for sure. He had no choice but to trust him. He had to be ready. He had to fight. As they reached a large door at the end of the hall, the Vampire King stopped and turned to face him. Behind this door lies your next challenge, he said. Are you prepared? Ethan took a deep breath, his hands now steady, his heart focused. He was no longer the scared boy who had run to the Vampire King for help. He was something more. He was ready to face whatever came next. I'm ready, Ethan said again. The Vampire King nodded approvingly and opened the door. As the door creaked open, Ethan stepped into the room beyond. It was filled with strange symbols, glowing with an ethereal light. At the center of the room was a pedestal upon which rested an object, a sword, forged from what appeared to be obsidian and bone. The Vampire King's voice echoed through the room. This is the Sword of Shadows. It is a weapon forged in the darkest corners of the vampire world. It will test you, Ethan, but it is also a key to your future. Ethan stepped forward, his mind racing. The sword glowed faintly, its edges sharp and jagged. It seemed to pulse with an energy that was both alluring and terrifying. He reached out to take it, but the moment his fingers touched the hilt, the room erupted with a burst of energy. Shadows swirled around him, forming shapes, faces, and figures. Ethan instinctively pulled the sword into a defensive position, his heart pounding. Focus! The Vampire King's voice rang out from the shadows. Control your fear. Control the power within you. Only then will you be able to wield the Sword of Shadows. Ethan's grip tightened around the hilt as the shadows began to close in on him. He knew that this was his trial now. It wasn't just about power, it was about control. And if he couldn't control it, he wouldn't survive. The room seemed to close in around him, the darkness suffocating. But Ethan stood tall, the sword in his hand glowing with a fierce light. He was ready, and this time, nothing would stop him. Ethan gripped the Sword of Shadows tightly, the hilt warm beneath his fingers. The shadows that swirled around him seemed to come alive, pressing in from every angle. They weren't just a physical force. They were an embodiment of his deepest fears, his anxieties, his regrets. But he wasn't a child anymore. He had power now, and he was determined to control it. The sword thrummed with energy, responding to his thoughts, to his emotions. It was as though it recognized him, understood his hesitation and his resolve, and now, it was waiting for him to command it. With a deep breath, Ethan swung the sword in front of him, pushing the shadows back. They recoiled, but only momentarily. They didn't give up easily. The Vampire King's voice echoed through the darkness, his words steady and commanding. Focus, Ethan. You are not just wielding a sword. You are wielding your will. Your fear will not defeat you. Let it go. Ethan felt the weight of the king's words sink in. Fear. It was always fear, wasn't it? Fear of failure, fear of the unknown, fear of what he might become. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about his fear. It was about the people he loved, the ones who were still in danger, the ones who depended on him. His mother, the world outside these walls. He had to push through it. His heart steadied as he took another step forward, the sword slicing through the air in a smooth arc. The shadows seemed to flinch, but they didn't retreat. They formed shapes, shifting forms that looked almost human, but distorted, warped by the darkness they carried. They whispered his name, trying to pull him back into the fear that had gripped him before. Ethan, they murmured, you cannot control it. You are not meant for this. The words sliced through him like a knife, but he fought against them. He wasn't the scared boy anymore. He wasn't going to let these illusions control him. He lifted the sword, its dark blade glowing with a faint, menacing light. I am not afraid, he said, his voice barely a whisper, but firm in its resolve. The shadows roared in defiance, but Ethan stood tall. He raised the sword high and struck. The shadows writhed and recoiled, but the blade cut through them with ease, the dark magic dissipating like mist in the air. He had done it, but it wasn't over. More shadows surged toward him, faster, more aggressive. Ethan's pulse raced, but this time, the fear didn't take hold of him. He knew what he had to do. The sword was an extension of him, his will now shaping the magic that surged through his body. With each swing, the shadows weakened, retreating farther back into the corners of the room. The trial wasn't just about defeating these illusions. It was about proving to himself that he could control the power within him, that he could stand against the forces that sought to destroy him. The room began to shift, the shadows becoming more intense, more real. Ethan's heart pounded, but the sword pulsed with energy, guiding him. You must not falter. The Vampire King's voice cut through the chaos. You are in control. Now prove it. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward, the blade sweeping through the air in a decisive arc. The shadows faltered, dissipating under the force of his will. The sword thrummed, its energy crackling as it absorbed the darkness. Ethan's mind raced. He had to keep going. He couldn't stop now. With every strike, he pushed the shadows back further, until the room began to clear. The energy in the air shifted, the oppressive weight of the shadows lifting. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness retreated entirely. Ethan stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving as the sword hummed in his hand. The shadows were gone. The trial was over. The Vampire King stepped forward, his eyes glowing with approval. You have passed, he said. But this is only one part of the battle. You've learned control, but you must now learn strategy, cunning. There will be others who will test you, Ethan, and they will not be so easily defeated. Ethan nodded, his grip on the sword tightening. He wasn't naive enough to think the trial was the end. This was only the beginning. He had faced his fear and come out stronger. But the real battle lay ahead. He could feel it, the weight of the future pressing down on him, the uncertainty of what was to come. The Vampire King's gaze softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. You are ready for the next step, but you must remember this. Fear will always be with you. The question is, will you let it control you, or will you control it? Ethan looked at the king, the weight of his words settling in his chest. I will control it, he said firmly. The king nodded, his expression serious. Good. Then let us begin the next phase of your training. The darkness was gone, but the path ahead was still shrouded in mystery. Ethan had made it this far, but he knew that the true challenge had only just begun. Ethan stood tall, the sword of shadows still glowing faintly in his hand. His body was exhausted from the trial, but his mind was sharp. The room, now clear of the oppressive darkness, felt strangely empty, as though something had shifted within him. He had faced his fear, confronted the darkness within himself, and emerged victorious. But the Vampire King's words echoed in his mind. This is only one part of the battle star. Ethan's heart pounded with a sense of urgency. He wasn't naive. He knew that this was just the beginning. The king was watching him closely, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. There was approval in those eyes, but it was tempered with the weight of the challenges ahead. You have learned control, the Vampire King said, his voice steady and filled with authority. But now, You must learn how to use that control strategically. The world we are in is not just one of raw power. It is a world of politics, alliances, and enemies who are far more cunning than your father ever was. Ethan's grip tightened on the sword as the king's words sank in. It wasn't just about strength. He had to be smart. He had to outthink those who would seek to use him. What do I need to do? Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. The Vampire King's gaze darkened. You will face enemies, not just in battle, but in the court of vampire politics. There are factions who will try to control you, manipulate you, and even destroy you if you stand in their way. The sword is powerful, but your mind must be sharper. Ethan nodded, understanding the gravity of the king's words. His powers were still growing, but they would only take him so far. If he wanted to protect those he loved, he had to learn how to navigate the intricate and dangerous web of vampire politics. The Vampire King turned, walking toward a large, ancient bookcase on the far side of the room. The shelves were lined with thick volumes and scrolls, each one seemingly older than the last. This is where your true training begins, the king said, his hand hovering over one of the books. He pulled it from the shelf and handed it to Ethan. This book contains the history of the vampire clans, their alliances, and their betrayals. It will teach you what you need to know about the powers at play. The power of information is just as important as the power of strength. Ethan took the book, feeling its weight in his hands. It was ancient, the leather cover worn with age. The knowledge contained within it was more than just history. It was the key to surviving the challenges ahead. You will study this book, the king continued. Learn everything you can about the vampire families, their rivalries, their weaknesses. And most importantly, learn about yourself. Your bloodline is tied to this world in ways you cannot yet understand. The more you know, the better equipped you will be to navigate this war. Ethan nodded, a new sense of purpose filling him. He had always thought that the power he wielded was just about fighting, about defeating his enemies with strength. But now, he understood, it was about more than just fighting. It was about surviving, about outsmarting those who sought to use him. I will learn, Ethan said, determination rising in his chest. The Vampire King smiled, a rare expression of approval. Good. Knowledge is the foundation of true power. But remember, there is always a price for that knowledge. The more you learn, the more you will be drawn into the game. You will be forced to make decisions, hard decisions that will shape the fate of many. Ethan's mind raced at the thought. He had already made one decision. He had chosen to stand with the Vampire King, to embrace his power and face the dangers ahead. But what about the future? What choices would he have to make as his journey continued? What if I can't make the right decisions? Ethan asked, his voice softer now. The king's expression hardened. There is no such thing as a perfect decision. Every choice will have consequences, Ethan. Some will be small, some will be disastrous. But you must be willing to live with the choices you make. That is what it means to wield power. Ethan's chest tightened. The weight of the responsibility was heavier than he had imagined. But he couldn't back down now. He had already come so far, and he had promised to protect the people he loved. I'll do whatever it takes, Ethan said, the words coming from somewhere deep within him. Then we begin, the Vampire King said, his voice resolute. You will start your studies immediately. But know this, your enemies are already aware of your existence. They know that you are no longer the boy they can control, and they will come for you. The Vampire King's words hit Ethan like a bolt of lightning. His enemies weren't just a distant threat, they were already closing in on him. But he couldn't let that stop him. He couldn't let fear control him again. He had to prepare. He had to learn. The king turned and began to walk toward the door. Let's see what you're truly made of, Ethan, he said, his voice filled with cold promise. Ethan followed the king out of the room, the weight of his new reality settling over him. This wasn't just about surviving the trials he had faced. It was about surviving what was coming next. And he would survive. He had no other choice. Ethan stood in the study, surrounded by the weight of ancient knowledge. The Vampire King had left him to study, to learn the secrets hidden within the countless books and scrolls. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, the atmosphere heavy with centuries of power and intrigue. Ethan had already begun to sense the gravity of the situation. His powers were growing. But with each step forward, he felt more and more that there was something waiting for him, a responsibility, a burden he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The Vampire King had warned him, knowledge was not without consequence. The more he learned, the more entangled he would become in a web of politics, alliances, and ancient wars. He had made a choice to embrace his powers, but he hadn't realized just how much those powers would demand of him. The room was quiet, save for the soft rustle of pages as Ethan flipped through another tome. His eyes scanned the words, though he struggled to understand some of the more complex passages. The language of the vampire clans was ancient, filled with terms and phrases that were difficult to grasp. But there was something else, the hidden meanings between the lines. The Vampire King had said to learn the history of the clans, their alliances, their betrayals. That was where the true power lay. And so, Ethan immersed himself in the books, searching for the answers, for the key to his survival in this treacherous world. As the hours passed, Ethan felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. His body ached from the constant studying, but it was his mind that felt the true strain. The more he learned, the more he realized that the game he had been thrust into was far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. There were enemies out there, and not all of them were as obvious as his father had been. Some were hidden in plain sight, masquerading as allies, waiting for the right moment to strike. As Ethan closed another book, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to see the Vampire King standing in the doorway, his dark figure filling the frame. The king's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Ethan's heart race. "You have been studying," the king said, his voice low, a hint of approval in his tone. "But now it is time to put what you have learned to the test." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked. The king stepped into the room, his gaze scanning the scattered books and scrolls that lay around Ethan. "You have learned the history of the vampire clans, the politics, the alliances," he said. "But knowledge alone is not enough. You must learn how to navigate this world, how to move within it without becoming a pawn." Ethan's pulse quickened. "How do I do that?" The Vampire King smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was cold, calculating. "You must confront those who would use you," he said. "You must face the enemies who are already watching you." The words hit Ethan like a blow. His mind raced, but he didn't have time to process it all. "How?" he asked, his voice a little shakier than he intended. "We will begin with a test," the king said. "You will face someone from one of the vampire houses. Someone who will challenge you. Someone who will try to manipulate you. You must be ready for this, Ethan. This is how you learn to survive." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. A challenge. He had been preparing for this, but nothing could have prepared him for what was coming. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady, though the uncertainty still lingered in his chest. The Vampire King nodded, turning on his heel. "Follow me," he said, and Ethan did as he was told. As they walked through the mansion, the atmosphere seemed to grow darker. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the echo of their footsteps on the stone floors. Finally, they reached a door at the end of a long hallway. The Vampire King stopped and turned to face Ethan. "Behind this door," he said, his voice low, "is where your next lesson begins." Ethan's stomach twisted with nerves, but he nodded. He had come this far. He couldn't turn back now. The door creaked open, revealing a large, dimly lit room. At the center, a figure stood, shrouded in shadows. The figure's presence was commanding, the air around them thick with tension. Ethan could feel it. This was no ordinary test. This was a confrontation. The Vampire King stepped aside, gesturing for Ethan to approach. "This is your challenge," he said, his tone neutral. "Face your opponent, Ethan. Show me that you can stand on your own." Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward, his grip tightening on the sword of shadows. He didn't know who this person was, but he could feel the weight of their gaze, their power. The figure stepped forward, revealing their face. A woman, her features sharp and striking. Her eyes glowed with the same intense crimson light as the Vampire King's, and her expression was cold, calculating. "You must be Ethan," she said, her voice smooth and like velvet. "The new player in this game." Ethan stood tall, trying to steady his nerves. "Who are you?" The woman smiled, her lips curling into a knowing smirk. "I am someone who will test you. Someone who will see if you are truly worthy of the power you've awakened." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. This was no ordinary trial. This was a battle of minds, of wits. He wasn't just facing a physical challenge. He was facing someone who would challenge him in every way. And for the first time, Ethan realized that this was what the Vampire King had meant. This was the game. A game of manipulation, of strategy, of survival. And Ethan was right in the middle of it. Ethan stood across from the woman, his sword held tightly in his hand, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. Her eyes glowed with a predatory gleam, studying him like a hawk ready to strike. The room seemed to hum with tension, and Ethan could feel the power within him surging. This wasn't just a test of strength, it was a test of everything he had learned, everything he had become. "You're confident," the woman said, her voice smooth, like honey with a hidden venom. "But confidence alone won't save you." Ethan didn't flinch. He had been trained for this, prepared by the Vampire King. He had already faced the darkness inside himself, fought through his fears, and now he was ready to confront whatever this woman had in store for him. "I'm not afraid of you," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I've come this far, and I'll finish this." The woman smirked. "You think you're ready for the challenges ahead? For the true darkness that waits?" Ethan tightened his grip on the Sword of Shadows. "I'm ready for whatever comes." She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "We'll see about that." Without warning, she lunged at him, her movements so fast they blurred. Ethan barely had time to react. He swung the sword in a wide arc, but she was already gone, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. He spun around, his heart racing. The woman was fast, too fast, and she was using the shadows against him. The room around them seemed to shift, the walls stretching, the shadows growing longer and deeper, as if the very space itself was working against him. Ethan's mind raced. He had to stay focused. He had to trust in what the Vampire King had taught him. He could feel the magic inside him, swirling, ready to be used. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. The magic responded to his thoughts, and suddenly, he could feel the woman's presence, even in the darkness. He opened his eyes and swung the sword again, this time more calculated, more precise. The blade cut through the air, and this time, it connected. The woman stumbled back, her eyes widening in surprise. She hadn't expected him to be so in tune with his power. Ethan pressed his advantage, moving forward with controlled strikes, each one infused with the magic that pulsed through him. But she was quick, always staying one step ahead, darting in and out of the shadows. Ethan's breath came faster, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't. His mother, the people he cared about, they were all depending on him. He wasn't going to let this woman, or anyone, take that from him. The woman finally stopped moving, standing still in the center of the room, her eyes narrowing. "You're not just a child," she said, a hint of respect in her voice. "You've got power, real power. But you still have much to learn. You're not ready for what's coming." Ethan's sword lowered slightly, but his resolve only hardened. "I'm ready," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "I'll do whatever it takes." The woman's lips curled into a smile. "Then you'll have to fight harder than this." With a flick of her wrist, the shadows around her seemed to ripple, coalescing into sharp tendrils that lashed out at Ethan. He ducked just in time, the shadowy tendrils missing him by inches. He didn't hesitate. He raised his sword, channeling the magic into it, and swung. The blade cut through the shadows like they were nothing, severing them with ease. He wasn't just fighting her. He was fighting his own fears, his own doubts. Each strike was a declaration. He was no longer the scared boy who had stumbled into this world. He was a warrior, and he would protect those he loved, no matter the cost. With one final, sweeping strike, Ethan's sword collided with the woman's form, sending a shockwave of energy through the room. She staggered back, a look of disbelief on her face as the shadows around her dissipated. Ethan stood, panting, his sword lowered, but his eyes never leaving her. "You've passed," the woman said, her voice tinged with both admiration and something else, perhaps regret. "But this is just one battle. The real war is ahead of you, and it will not be as simple as you think." Ethan's mind raced as the weight of her words settled on him. He wasn't naive enough to think this was over. He had already faced so much, but he knew the true challenges were just beginning. The woman stepped back, fading into the shadows once more. "Go," she said softly. "Prepare yourself. The real test is yet to come." Ethan didn't need any more words. He turned and walked toward the door, the sword of shadows heavy in his hand. As he left the room, the Vampire King was waiting for him, his eyes studying him carefully. "You did well," the king said. "But remember, this is just the beginning. You've faced one of the many obstacles that will stand in your way, but there will be more, and they will be more dangerous." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the king's words. The journey was far from over, but he had made it this far. He wasn't going to stop now. He had a future to fight for, and no one, not even the darkness, could take that from him. In this thrilling continuation of our vampire stories, Ethan embarks on an unforgettable journey as he discovers the true power within himself. As he faces both his deepest fears and powerful enemies, Ethan is forced to confront his own doubts and insecurities while learning how to control the magic that runs through his veins. With each battle, Ethan becomes more than just a scared boy. He becomes a warrior in a world of shadows and ancient beings. As the Vampire King guides him, Ethan learns that the true test is not just about strength, but strategy and wisdom. This is a story filled with power, betrayal, and the unrelenting struggle to protect those he loves. In the world of vampire stories, nothing is ever as it seems, and Ethan's journey is far from over. As he faces unimaginable challenges, Ethan must embrace his new reality, learning to wield his newfound abilities and navigate the dark politics of the vampire world. As the stakes rise, this vampire story continues to unfold, pushing Ethan to new heights and making him question everything he thought he knew about his world and himself. With each passing trial, the line between ally and enemy blurs, and Ethan must decide where he truly stands in this deadly game of power. Don't miss out on this exciting chapter in Vampire Stories, where every decision could change the course of Ethan's destiny forever.